Great, thank you. So yeah, welcome everybody. So we'll just get the session started. I know that there's a few people who are joining, but yeah, we'll be able to greet them as they come in. So welcome to this session. So this is a Birds of a Feather session, which is following on from a previous Birds of a Feather session at P21. So whereas that session was called Let's Talk About Mappings, the session is called Let's Keep Talking About Mappings. So we put this together as part of the proposed Fair Mappings Working Group. That title is yet to be decided. And we'll be discussing the steps we've made since P21 up to now with the preparations for setting that working group up. Jan, if you just go on to the next slide, please. So as you have heard already, and as you receive a notification, this session is being recorded. I'll just repost again for those of you who don't have it, a link to the collaborative notes document in the chat. There is a link to the slides that are being used and a link to other various bits of information in there. And there's also a table towards the top of the document. If you could just sign in there, that would be appreciated. Also, if you wouldn't mind keeping your mics on mute during the presentations, we will there'll be plenty of room for discussion later. So we will invite any questions you have there or comments. But if you do have questions throughout the presentations, if you can please add them into the Zoom chat, or you can add them to the collaborative notes towards the end of the document. There's a space for any questions or comments. Next slide. Yeah, cool. So I'll just run very quickly through the agenda before I hand over to my colleagues Jan Lefranc and Jonas Cassignemi. So basically, the session is structured around two questions. So where do we start and where do we like to go? So the first question, we will have a short introduction from Jan on a summary of the P21 BoF and the other bits of activity that will have gone on since then. We'll also have a presentation of the ongoing work in Fair Impact and Fair Core FreeOSC projects from Jan and from Jonas. We'll then move on to a presentation of the current status of the working group, and in particular the case statement, so where we like to go. So that will be led by Jan, and that will kind of lead us into the interactive session, where we'll be relying on your input. We might be using a Slido for that section, but we'll invite your comment and feedback on various bits of the case statement that Jan will present. So with that, I will hand over to you, Jan. Yeah, apologies, you're muted.
Sorry about that. When you're a presenter mode, getting back to the mic unmute button is a bit tricky sometimes. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. As Ryan was mentioning, the idea of this BoF is to actually discuss with you the progress we've made on writing the charter for the Fair Mapping Working Group that was discussed in the previous RDA plenary. We were hoping initially that the charter would be ready for complete review for this BoF, but unfortunately we have been a bit slowed down. So that means that we are still open to any comments, so feel free to just steer down what we have done so far or improve, because we know that there's a lot of room for improvement. And how this initiative started, it started from last year RDA plenary in Austria, during the International Data Week, where we organized two sessions. One session for SciDataCon, where we presented extensively the Fair Impact and Fair Core for EOSC projects, the outputs and of these projects, and also trying to assess the needs from community about this kind of work, how it will be useful for various communities. And we had this Bird of a Feather session that was organized, where we had a presentation for about 13 different potential usage of mappings coming from a broad range of communities. During that BoF, we made some Slido and we collected some of your inputs. And I'm just pointing out two interesting results there of the inputs we collected. about the kind of entities that you would be interested in mapping. Will it be concept classes, data items, metadata schemas, and so on. And we came up with this list where some of the attendees were willing to map everything, which is great, a bit ambitious. Also, concept and class, properties, data, metadata schema, and even codes, which holds for classification, like standardized classification, like a UN classification that have specific code, for instance. And we wondered what would be a compelling output for such a RDA working group, and we ended up with this short list. Basically, a lot of us, of the attendees, were interested in a terminology on mappings, because we identify that mappings means different things depending on the person you talk to, and with the kind of entities that we just presented before, that makes sense, because an ontology mapping is not the same as a data mapping. And we need to clarify when we discuss the kind of mapping we're talking about. And in order to do that, the idea was to get a terminology. At least that's what we got from as a feedback. Also, there were some inputs on, well, it should be use case based, to which we totally agree. We should provide some demo of interoperability, which is an interesting point. Also, a generic model to represent the mappings. There was a request for best practices and how to do mappings, and also the need for registries of mappings. So at the end of that bird of a feather, we agreed that, well, both Younes and myself, we would lead a group to put together a working group to actually tackle these issues, and to actually try to come up with compelling outputs. And this I will present you later on. And I will describe the current status. And again, the idea here is that we get an open floor, and that you can actually push some ideas, provide some comments, and even propose some additional inputs if you think it's necessary. So to do that, before doing that, I would like to start. We would like to start presenting the status updates of Fair Impact and FAIRCORE for EOSC, because one of the core idea of this working group is that we do get funding out of this project to actually work on these issues at the European level. And that is actually very important, because that gives us leeway to actually chair this group and work extensively and actively on these matters, because we're already doing that partly in our projects. And another thing is, we would like to actually bring to this working group some of the outputs of the project, so that they can be validated not only by the European communities, but also at the international level, so that actually we are we could consider having sets of recommendations that come out of the working group that does not just apply to Europe, but also for the rest of the world. And for that, it's a great platform. So I will start briefly presenting the Fair Impact project in a nutshell. For those of you who do not know Fair Impact, it's a Horizon Europe funded project. It started in June 2022. So we are already 2 years ahead. It remains a year. The idea is to well, enable to expand fair solutions in Europe. So looking at basically the different activities, the different practices around fair, and try to come up with some summary that could be a common guidelines on how to make your data fair. And by data, we mean different types of data, because of course you get the raw data, numbers, and and this kind of things, but you also have other types of data like semantic artifacts that are of importance, or even no mapping. And we have a task on mapping. So what do we mean by mapping? I love showing this cat because I'm a cat lover, this slide because I'm a cat lover. So the idea is that, at least in the initial sense, you make mappings between of the semantics of different sources. So here, for instance, you could imagine that you have two databases talking about cats. One is about domestic cat. The other one is about the Felis silvestris catus, which is the biological species name. And you would like to reconcile them because you would like to search through these two databases, and you need to tell the computer that basically they are the same, because computer is not like human. They don't understand this kind of notions. And you sometimes even want to make it broader because you want to associate these two databases with another one that talks about domestic animals. And then you need to actually specify the relation between the concepts or how they are interconnected so that it can help you to search through these resources in a harmonized way. If you think about it at the conceptual level, a mapping, whatever the mapping is a relation between two entities. So we've seen it could be a concept about domestic cat and the corresponding species name, but it can be, well, data, temperature measured in Celsius and a temperature measured in Kelvin. It could be a metadata schema. Maybe you would like to align your own community metadata schema to DCAT, for instance, which is a W3C standard. And then you will have to specify that, for instance, an author is the same as a creator, although it's an approximation that is going to be necessary for you if you want to reconcile or if you want to convert. So in the end, a mapping is just three elements, the source entity, the target entity, and the relation that links them together. Now, if I just give you that, which is the most common way of doing things right now, because actually most of the communities that are doing mappings, they do that in an Excel spreadsheet, and they even skip the middle property that relates the thing. It's just a correspondence table, which assumes by default that they are equivalent or same. So one of the issue is that we need to change this practice so that we can further specify the relation, because in some cases they are not the same or they are not exactly the same. So telling the computer that they are exactly the same may lead to issues further along the way. And most importantly, they need to be documented, because you can make any assumption, that's fine. I mean, you will do that for your own use case. But if I want to reuse your mappings, because that's going to be helpful for me, I need to know, well, can I reuse them? So I need a license, who's done these mappings, we need provenance, and we need explanation. Why did you make this assumption, right? And where this assumption holds and where it doesn't hold. Okay, so basically, the mapping is not just these three entities. It needs to be also associated metadata so that it becomes a documented mapping. And in many cases, that's not even there. So you just have, as I said, two columns. You don't know who created it. It's on GitHub. Fine, just have fun with it. And then these mappings, well, this is for individual entities. Now, well, these mappings, if you map a full-fledged metadata schema to DCAT, then you will have a lot of mappings to do. And these mappings are organized into what's called a mapping set, or commonly called a crosswalk, because that would be all the rules that will help you to go from one to the other. Now, in Fair Impact, our objective is to actually start establishing guidelines on how to make this mapping fair, because in many, many, many cases, they are not easy to find. You need to know where they are hosted or who has been doing mappings. Sometimes they're published on the website, sometimes they're published on GitHub, sometimes they're not published at all, and they are absolutely not documented in any way. So basically, they are hard to reuse. However, we are conscious that the mapping exercise is a slow process. It takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. Therefore, we are strong believers that they must be shared so that you can valorize the effort. And avoid others to spend this time and resources to do exactly the same thing than you and avoid duplication. So basically, these mappings that are existing are currently not fair, and we want to help the communities to make them fair. So we want to examine the technical requirements that would be necessary to transform unfair mapping to fair mappings. In the meanwhile, fair is about machine actionability. And if we really want to push it toward this fair objective, we also are working on a machine actionable common exchange model. We understand that work has been done previously. You are using your system, your model, and your way of doing things, and it's going to be hard to completely transform everything. However, if we have a common exchange model, things that you have done in your way could be transformed into a common model so that it could be shared easily and reused easily. In order to do that, we don't want to create everything from scratch because there are tons of things that exist already. So the idea of fair impact is to co-create, test, and adopt the models for fair mappings and to identify also what the existing methodologies and practices around mappings. And finally, we would like to work on something that is also essential for mappings, is governance, and to try to see if we can establish from the communities a consensus on a generic governance framework, because, well, things change over time, mappings may become obsolete, and therefore, how do you deal with that kind of things? Or mappings may change because the ontologies that are mapped together have evolved over time, and how do you cope with that? So that's essential. So our way of handling the problem is to see the problem on the two faces. One is the technical aspect on how to make things fair, and the model. The other one is more related on the practice, right? Because not all the scientific communities are actually dealing with mappings, or they know how to do this. So the idea would be to start putting together some common framework that could be useful for communities that haven't started the mapping process to actually have a sort of a ground framework to actually kickstart the work in a structured way in their own organization, and to also highlight the important points that needs to be considered when you start the activity of mapping. So to kickstart the discussions, we had a workshop last year in April, which was the first workshop organized by Fair Impact on, well, developing the requirements for fair mappings, where we had 120 registered participants from 24 countries, 24 organizations, 32 domains of knowledge, which is quite impressive. We were dumbstruck to have so many people, which means that I think it's a burning problem for most of us. So it's important that we're doing this work. And we discussed specific topics like specification of fair mappings connected to the FAIR principles themselves, so that you get the specification, and at some point you can consider thinking about evaluation of the fairness as well. Types of mappings, because as I was saying, there are different types of mappings, data mappings, metadata schema, and so on and so forth. So we'd like to understand what are the specificities of the different types of mappings, existing tools and requirements for tools, because, well, that's going to be important to support the mapping process and mapping methodology. So from this first workshop, we started collecting inputs, a lot of them, and we have been working internally to come up with fair recommendation documents that I hinted in November. It took us a little bit more time than initially anticipated, because we needed to find a way to structure our approach. So you can think about two different approaches. You go with, for each individual fair principle, you go and come up with recommendations, or you start to pull together some of the individual fair principles so that the recommendation applies for many of them, because that's often the case. And so what we started to do is started grouping the fair principles into four categories: model and format, metadata, PID, and service and API, right? And model and format deals with interoperability and reusability. metadata with findability and reusability as well. PAD is mostly for findability. And then the service and API relates to both accessibility, but also findability, right? Because you want the service to be useful to find actually the mapping. Our first recommendation since the beginning is use SESAM whenever you can. There is very few models out there that exist. There is another one that's called eDual, which is very specific for formal ontology mappings. But other than that, there's not that many. And the main one that came out a few years ago is SESAM, that stands for Simple Standard for Sharing Ontology Mappings. Which actually is interesting because it's based on the initial assumption that I made, is that most of the people doing mappings, they do that with an Excel spreadsheet. So the idea was to build an extended model that would use TSV as a representation, so that it can contain a lot of the information that is necessary, and in particular a lot of metadata to explain what the mapping is about and how it's been created, and all the necessary information you need for reuse. So this is the first recommendation we've made already in November during the P21. And then we've been looking at the SESAM model, because SESAM is for what's called simple mappings, direct class-to-class mappings. It offers a lot of flexibility for that. You can use for the predicate, which is the link that relates to two entities, a lot of the existing predicates from SCOS, from OWL. So it really depends on your use case. But then if you start dealing with things like metadata schema, some of these elements or relations do not apply. And in many cases, you would have how to say, mappings that will need many-to-ones or one-to-many connections. And a simple example that comes to my mind is that in your metadata schema, you would represent the author with the full name, and in another format that you would like to map to, well, the author is not full name, but it's first name, last name. And you need to bridge these concepts together so that actually, well, you can go from one to the other. But then that's a bit more complicated, just to say that they're related, because they are related with a certain order, right? If your full name is, you start with first name, last name, then you need to specify that first name needs to be the first, and then last name needs to be the second, so that you can merge the data together. So what we did within the Fair Impact Group is to start looking at how can we change SESAM or update SESAM model so that we can extend that for further mapping. And what we realized is that, as I was mentioning, mapping is three entities, and the same goes for SESAM model. The three entities, the subject, the object, and the relation that links them together. And that's what we call the core mapping, right? And this is your initial mapping with nothing else. And the idea is that if we need to change something for data transformation or for copying with one-to-many or many-to-one, that's the part that we need to change. And we don't necessarily need to change the subject and the object, but we certainly have to extend the kind of relation and the predicate. So what we started to think is that it's worth is we consider submodules or various models, core models of the mapping that could be extended in SESAM or linked with SESAM. One of the reasons for that is that SESAM comes with a very extensive metadata schema, which is very good actually, and very covers a lot of aspects, and I'm going to talk about that later. So we should keep that metadata, and we just could change the bare minimum we need to change, right? And so, for instance, I'm giving you an example here where the initial core model works fine for ontology mapping or vocabulary mappings, or even sometimes in metadata schemas when you just have one-to-one relations. But then if you start having data and metadata schemas, well, data, if you want to go from one data format to another, there will be a transformation that applies. That could be a mathematical function, and therefore the relation is not going just to be the predicate, like our equivalent class in the example here, but it's going to be a more complex function. And we need to see how we can represent that so that it's actually embedded into the initial SESM. And there might be also some additional information we need to add, like for instance, well, the order in the case of full name, first name, last name. Back to metadata, one of the work that we did in Fair Impact is starting looking at what kind of metadata is necessary for finding and reusing mappings, right? And so in order to do that, we started working together and brainstorming on what kind of queries do we need to make, or do we want to make to actually find mappings the way we want. And we came up with a list of initial queries that could be, of course, extended. We didn't cover all the cases. And so that's why we have this discussion today, that's something that we can work on together to extend. But the idea was that from the query, I can identify easily the kind of information I need to provide as metadata to answer that query. And from the queries, we started to extract a list of metadata fields that would be necessary to address each of these queries. And once we had this list of metadata fields, we started looking into the SESM model to see whether or not the SESM model covers everything or if we need to expand. And it turns out that for a few exceptions, except for two exceptions, and that might be due also to ambiguous naming, well, the SESM model is, the metadata schema is perfect. It covers everything and even provides more information that we were looking for. And the two exceptions were mapping context, which was proposed actually in the side data concession when we collected input for what kind of metadata would we need for findability. And that mapping context is a way to link to the use case so that you understand the context in which this mapping has been done. And the other one is the need to actually be able to search for mappings that deals with specific ontologies or links specific ontologies together, which is not present in the SESM model. But in any case, the second recommendations we make on the metadata is that whether you use SESM as the model or not, sorry, Zoom does funny things. Basically, the idea is that whether you use it or not, use the metadata schema to describe your mappings, right? Because it's complete enough and it's going to be extremely useful for everyone you would be sharing the mapping with. We've been also looking at mappings and the PIDs or GUPRIs, or for globally unique, persistent, and resolvable identifiers. So in SESM, basically only the mapping set or the collections of mappings as a GUPRI or PID. And that's an issue because that means that you don't have a PID for each individual mappings. Now, what if I want to actually reuse mappings from several collections to create my own collections? Well, that's not possible. I will have to duplicate the mappings because I cannot just use the PID. There's no PID that points to that individual mapping. So one of the propositions we make is that we need to update SESM or actually take this into account in the generic model that each individual mapping should have a unique identifier, right? Now, when you start scratching a little bit down the problem, then you realize that, well, it means also that the entities that are mapped must have a GUPRI or PID. So for vocabularies or ontology, that's fine because they have URIs. And usually we try, the people doing these ontologies make them persistent. So, and they are resolvable, so that's great. But then if you start mapping JSON metadata schemas, how do you globally unique provide a globally unique identifier to your JSON element? And that's the kind of issue that needs to be considered when you do mappings and use GUPRIs to make them fair. Another aspect is that FAIR principles focus on the fact that metadata also needs to have a GUPRI. The metadata record needs to be addressed and have a unique identifier, and it even must contain, and that is missing in the metadata, it must contain a metadata fields that points to the GUPRI of the individual mapping. So basically, you will have the PID for the metadata record that contains the PID to get to the data. And that, well, I can understand that when you share the mapping with other, it's self-contained. The metadata is contained with the mapping in the file, so that you will not provide the metadata PID for the metadata because, well, you don't need it. It's all addressed in the file. And therefore, that is going to fall on the meta mapping repository service to actually provide you GUPRIs for the metadata record and to make the link with the core data. So that's for the technical, and just to give you an overview of the way we're thinking, which also explains why we are taking a little bit more time than anticipated, because when you start scratching the surface, you realize that there are other problems that come up along the way. So if we want to make meaningful recommendations, well, we need to actually dig and investigate all the edge cases and issues so that we can make meaningful recommendations. So hopefully in the upcoming weeks, there will be a first version which would be open for community review, that we hope that the working group will be able to review as well and provide extensions so that these recommendations are also including the thoughts of the people involved in the working group. The other aspect, and I'm gonna go quickly through that, is that we, as I said, we want also to understand the community practices around mapping. Is there a generic workflow that you can apply if you don't have any? What are the things you need to take into consideration? So in order to address that, we plan to organize a series of 3 workshops and a survey. We had the first workshop on November 24th last year, which was also very successful. And the idea was to gather inputs from communities of practice and to discuss the commonalities between this community of practice. And one of the outcome of this workshop is that there was a lot of discussion, very interesting. Some of the communities has very structured process. Some of them do not necessarily have such a process formalized. So it was very interesting to see that. And an outcome was that we came up with what we call the mapping practice workflow framework. And that framework, I will show you in a minute. Actually, we have this open survey on mapping practices and mappings. So if you are interested, please contribute. There are quite a few questions. I think we estimated that it would take 25 minutes to actually fill in the whole survey. I know it's a bit long, but we want to collect as much details we can so that we really understand the things. And the idea is that if you provide us all that information, we don't have to bother you after that to ask you specific questions. So please, we already have quite a few of these answered. But so please just contribute and help us to identify all these common issues with mappings. We had a second workshop very recently, like end of April, and the idea was to test the framework that came out from the first workshop. We tested that with 5 different communities. That was very insightful because we realized that it provided some structure to the communities to actually address the different aspects of the mapping workflow. And here is a sort of diagram that summarized the mapping framework, but I'm not going to go into the details. If you have any questions, just send me an email. I will be happy to address you to my colleagues that have been developing this. But the idea is that there are 5 phases. There is the pre-mapping phases, where basically all the stakeholders should be involved to define the overall context of mappings, like the scope, why do you do the mappings, the kind of mappings you want to do, is it just metadata or data or both, basically setting up the scene. Then there is the phase of mapping. Once you have defined everything, you know how to do the mappings, you get the structure, you know how to represent. So you just have to do the mapping, and that just involve experts for the mapping. Then there is a phase of review, which is necessary because, well, sometimes you have edge cases, it's hard to know. So the idea is that, well, there is a review process so that you curate the mapping and the metadata associated. And then once this mapping is review phase is done, so either it fails or you succeed. If it fails, you go back to the first phase and you restart the process to improve. If it's successful and the review passes, then you go directly to the next phase, which is hosting. So where do I publish my mappings and how do I make them available? And then there's the 5th phase, which is the maintenance. I mean, how do I make sure that these mappings are maintained all the time, which is a key issue. And I will stop there and give the floor to my colleague Jonas. I hope I didn't take too much time.
We are running a little bit late at the schedule, but I will try to be quick. If I could, I will take the screen sharing, so it's easier for me to switch the slide. Yeah, hello everybody. On my behalf too, I'm Joonas Käseniemi I work for CSC, and I've been working in this FairCore for EOS project. I will give you a very short, quick overview of the project, and then we will focus on one of the components or one of the work packages that is basically implementing many of the things that Jan just mentioned. So in a nutshell, this is the FairCore for EOS project. We are 2/3 into the project, so about 1 year left. And that's it. Let's go. So we have 9 components. So it's a big project, and the component that we're going to be focusing is the metadata schema and crosswalk registry. So basically, we are implementing something that would work as this mapping registry, and the goal is that it would implement the best practices that the Fair Impact project is publishing. And I wanted to highlight a couple of the things. So we have cases, case studies, and demonstrators with mapping use cases coming within the project. But as the project has progressed, we have been contacted, and we have extended our kind of like network of parties that we're working with mappings to other projects. For example, the BioDT project. So we are working with them in specific type of use cases for mappings. There is the also the BitInst project, and then the switch from Switzerland and related to the Connect to Me project. We are implementing, or with them we have, for example, a case where we are trying to implement the transformation processes between JSON, CSV, and XML formats into RDF, because that is something that they have been specializing in. But that's the quick introduction to the project bit, and because I want to get to the beef and something that is in the topic of this BoF. So the metadata schema and crosswalk registry, and this is my new way of trying to explain what it is. So there are basically 5 major features. So it allows you to register existing schemas and crosswalks in multiple formats. So you can maintain a schema for example, in JSON schema format or XML schema format. It can be an ontology, and as you can see in the MSCR glossary on the right, our definition of a schema is quite broad. So, for example, we also talk about vocabulary schema. So this schema of yours could be a vocabulary too. And the crosswalk, it could be an XSLT file, for example. It could be a piece of code, or it could be a session file. So all of those are the kind of file or kind of types of existing crosswalks that you can register in the MSCR. And what the MSCR provides is, for the schemas, for the supported schema formats and specific versions maybe of those schema formats, a harmonized view to all of those schemas. So it doesn't matter what was the original format, but in the MSCR you're able to view all of them in one specific way, and use those as part of the crosswalk editor tool. So the third box, or the third bullet there. So the MSCR includes a tool for creating crosswalks between those registered schemas. So you can't create schemas in the MSCR, but what you can do is you can take those and assign them as the source schema and a target schema, and then create a crosswalk within the MSCR. And then the end goal is that once you have this kind of mapping sets or crosswalks, you are able to, or the MSCR, I'm using this vague facilitate word here on purpose, but the goal is that the MSCR would actually provide you with the tools and that allows you to take an input data that confirms to the source schema, the identifier of the crosswalk, and then produce with those inputs produce an output document that would then confirm to the target schema. And the nice thing about that is that because you have references and the both of those schemas available, you can do validation beforehand and also afterwards. And this is something that makes or can add value to, for example, those XSLT based existing crosswalks, because you might not be able to, by looking at the crosswalk, you might not be able to figure out whether it does what it's supposed to do. But if you have the target schema available, you can at least validate that the whether or not the crosswalk worked as expected. And all of those, the registered schemas and the created crosswalks or registered crosswalks, there are versioning functionality related to those, and all of those are or handles are provided. So Jan mentioned these GUPRIs for different kinds of things. So basically, the MSCR will provide PID for they are GUPRIs for the metadata. The metadata schema is still quite minimal, but that will be extended. There is a identifier for the crosswalk or the schema itself, the content, and there are also identifiers for the individual mappings within a crosswalk. So, but because the way the MSCR views those crosswalks, that they're very contextual. So you might have exactly the same target source schema and target schema, but the crosswalk might be completely different, or it might be just a little bit different between, for example, two organizations or two use cases. So those individual mappings, they are using handle part identifiers. So it's always the identifier of a mapping consists of the identifier of the kind of like parent, so the mapping set or the crosswalk, and then appended with the ID of the mapping. And the kind of mapping types, this is also mentioned by Jan, that the MSCR supports are the semantic mappings. So for example, between classes or between concepts in a vocabulary, structural mappings. So you are able to restructure data, for example, going from two elements into one element, or do format conversions. So go from CSV files to XML files, or from JSON XML files to RDF files, and so on. And then also the value or data mappings. So I've been talking about value mappings, but I think data mapping is a more common word. So that would be that means that when you are doing the transformation from one instance document to another, you could use in addition to the schema mapping between those source and target documents, you could use additional mappings, for example, between vocabularies. So if there is a value in an element that comes from a vocabulary, and there is an existing other mapping between those values to some values in some other vocabulary, that can also be taken into consideration when transforming the documents. It will include unit conversions. So the value transformation might not be based on a vocabulary mapping, but rather some kind of function. And then also literal to vocabulary mappings. And I am actually currently attending the CRIS conference, so I have a couple of concrete examples for that crowd. So current research information system from the current research information system domain. So for example, the research.fi is a Finnish national CRIS system, and they have an activity code list, which consists of about like 200 different codes in a hierarchy. And then credit taxonomy is similar thing, but quite simple. So that is the case where you need this many-to-one type of mappings, like for example, from these different kinds of supervisor codes, or these are the labels for the codes actually from the research.fi side to this supervision thing in the credit taxonomy. And then similar thing with the structural mapping. So this research role in research output could be, for example, an XML part of an XML document. So where you have 3 different fields: first names, family name, and other name in output, and you want to combine those into one display person name element. Or I think this is the kind of like a reformatting the identifiers in different ways could be a case that comes up often. So you might have some custom element identifier link that looks like that, and you want to get rid of the beginning of the value. So you need to apply a function to it. Or you might want to append something, or add a prefix to it. Or it might require accessing the in this case the particular aspect of the XML schema specification. So you might need to be able to check what is the value of an attribute, and based on that apply some kind of function. And then the last one is actually the 11.1.1 is if I remember correctly, is the supervisor of doctoral candidate activity, and that could be mapped to credit taxonomy in a specific format. So we have been working on this for quite a bit, and what we are now doing, we have the kind of like the underlying infrastructure for storing those schemas in a harmonized structure. We have we have a structure, our own internal structure for storing those mappings, and that structure is built upon the requirements that are coming from the internal case studies, and also from this external extra case studies. And what we are is, so for example, here's a mapping issue that we have run into that we need to solve. So basically, here the thing is that the role code, so this is for example, the 11.1.1 needs to be mapped to this Serif 2 scholarly publications modules RDF structure. So there's a and we want to use the credit contribution statement, and it could be straightforward, but in some cases, because the target data model divides the credit contribution statement into 2 different attributes. So you have the role type and you have the degree of contribution, and the role code combines both of those. So there might be a principal investigator role code. So basically what you would probably need to do is you need to split it up into lead type of degree of contribution and let's say, is it investigation type of role type or something like that. So these are the kind of things that we are now looking into, and because this is what we are at the moment, we can do simple mappings. You can select the predicate, so you can do a bit more complex vocabulary mapping. So you don't have to use the exact match predicate always, but you can say the SCOS predicate set are there, and then you can add nodes. So that node is now the first mapping metadata that we have, but again, the plan is to extend it to the according to the SESAM metadata, mapping metadata model. And based on the analysis of the case studies, this is something that we need, or something like this is what we need. So you need to be able to filter the source properties somehow. So for example, you might only get the identifier elements where the value of an attribute is DOI, for example. And then you should be able to do these operations, and this is also coming from the SESAM model. So the source operations, mapping operations, and target operations. So it could involve data converting data types, or splitting strings, or combining stuff with different parameters. And of course, you could have, again, for example, in the same data mapping set or same crosswalk, multiple mappings that use the same operation, but just with different parameters. So this is what we're aiming for. And if you are able to do this and are using this, the benefits, there are multiple benefits. So for example, the mappings are stored in a structured machine readable format. So the internal format is it's not in any standard format, but the idea is that then you can export the current and upcoming, or either de facto or standard formats like SESAM. So, but that means that you can't export every crosswalk as SESAM, because it might contain more complex functionality. But then again, I'm referring to what Jan mentioned about the extending the SESAM, or you could maybe generate XSLT file from those from that internal mapping format. And as I mentioned, even though you would register an existing crosswalk, you have the added bonus that both the source and target schemas are explicitly linked to, and those are available, so you can use it for validation. And then the idea is also that the users could use the MSCR as a kind of like collaborative tool. So experts from both sides. So it could be that you don't have a single person that understands both the source and target schemas, but you could work together on that with the tool and figure out the best, or the mapping needed for that particular context. And then there is when you work with these vocabularies, ontologies, schemas, and functions in the it generates, or you create this, and these kind of links between elements or properties and vocabularies and elements and ontologies, and then again links between the vocabulary concepts and the ontology classes and properties, is something that we are hoping to tap into when, for example, suggesting mappings. So these two fields are probably a good match for a mapping, or even generating those mappings. And the timeline until the end of the project is that so before the summer or during the summer, we are hoping to get the first operationalization implementations available, something simple probably, but something that allows us to demonstrate the full circle from registering the schemas, creating the crosswalk, and transforming documents with that crosswalk. And in the fall, we're hopefully have the support for more complex mappings. And then winter 25, the release environment for public testing. So there is already a way to this form in the project's website with which you can express your interest in the different components of the project. But I'm here to tell you that you can do it already for the MSCR, but it will not be until the next year when you will get access to or we will be able to get, or it will be in the state where it's usable for public testing. So right now we are the people within the project are using it. And then of course in May everything is ready and works perfectly, as they always do after the project. thank you. That was the crash course to MSCR. So, Jan, do you want to take the screen back at this point?
Yes, just give me a sec.
Thanks, Eunice. One thing I would say, we're nearly at the top of the hour, so we do only have about 30-ish minutes left. So I know we do have kind of time for discussion planned, so I just want to bring that up.
Yeah, I think we need to speed up the next part a bit.
Let me try, because I tried the integration with Slido, but we might have some surprise. There it is. You see my screen? Yes. Why is it blue? So the idea is to give you the idea was to give you a short update on where we stand in Fair Corforius and Fair Impact, because that's going to be linked directly to the activity of the working group, right? So the idea is, again, what we do in the Fair Impact is not going to be restricted, or Fair Corforius is not going to be restricted just to Europe. It needs to be extended to the rest of the world and proposed to the working group so that it can be improved as well. So we can get direct feedback. And then after the project, it can be even continued, right, and pursued and improved. So we've been working since, I think we started in March, Ryan. So we submitted an application to RDA Tiger, and we do get the kind support from Ryan, who helped us organize several workshops of discussions to work on the charter. Here you have the link to the current version of the charter. It's not finished, so we still have to work on some aspects of the whole working group case statement. We also have access to the meeting minutes. Everything is open on the workshops. So one of the good things is, after 3 workshops, we converged on the initial charter, which means the identification of the problems and what we're proposing to solve these problems or address these problems, and in particular, the list of outputs. We also agreed on the value added. It needs to be improved in terms of writing, but it's just like cosmetics and clarifications. So the idea of this presentation is just to give you an overview of that. Actually, maybe Ryan, if you don't mind copying the link to the charter version, so if people want to go directly to the charter, they can. But the idea in the charter is that we identify the main problems that are already pointed out in my presentation. Initially, mappings are hard to find and hard to reuse. They are scattered across version control systems in most of the time. In some cases, you can find them on Ontoportal, which is also hosting mapping, but it's limited. So you have to search for them. It's not really easy. They are expressed in format that are not meant for automated processing. So if you want to use them into a real live information system, it's going to be tricky. You will have a lot of development to do. And the meaning of the term mapping is actually context sensitive. We saw that also with the presentation of Eunice. And that leads to ambiguity when we talk about mappings, right? So these are the core problems that we would like to address as working group. Now, we came up with a list of 5 planned outputs. The first one is the technical recommendations to make fair mapping and the fairness evaluation grid that should be associated with this. So this is the integration of the outcomes of fair impact in the group. The idea is that we evaluate the recommendations and we make counter recommendations or propositions for change. And in the meantime, we look at the technical implementation that are proposed, and those who agreed with, we can start to think, how do we integrate that into a fairness evaluation system, right? So that actually, if people want to know whether their mappings are fair, they do have a system to actually look how far they are and what needs to be changed so that it can become fair based on these recommendations. The other output is the harmonized mapping use case collection, because we strongly believe since the beginning that, well, without use case, we can't move forward in the many different other activities. And in particular, the terminology, if we want to make a classification of mappings, we need to get concrete use case with examples that explains the mapping, in which context they are made, what is exactly the mapping look like? Is it just a table in the data, or is it an XSLT? And concrete examples so that we can use that to, well, the classification, and also to actually come up with a generic exchange. So these outputs basically are interlinked, right? So from the use case, we go to the terminology and we work on the generic model. And then we thought about having a fair mapping knowledge base. So the idea is that we will have different outputs, and these outputs are interrelated. So it would be very nice to have a knowledge base so that you can search and find, for instance, okay, I am doing this kind of mapping. What is the generic model I need to use? What are the use cases, right? And so if you look at the outputs individually, one of the things that we need to do, we want to do, is to template, because we want to have a representative collections of the different types of mapping scenarios. For that, we are going to go through questionnaires, interview, literature review. There are other ways to do it, so we are open for suggestion on how to collect that. And it's going to be one of the sources that is going to be used to create the knowledge base. But it's also used for the mapping classification and ontology / ontology. That's why I put the slash here, because depending on the time we have at hand, we cannot necessarily promise to have a full-fledged ontology, but at least the idea is that we have a clear classification, hierarchical classification, with disambiguation of the different types of mappings. And then if we do get more resource and time, then we can go for ontologies. There are some that exist. There is SEMA-PV that's been developed alongside SESAM, which could be used. But there's also some classification or some ontology that were proposed by the brokering working group in RDA, and there's certainly others out there, so we need to do some landscape analysis. But the goal is that this classification / terminology / ontology is going to be published in a machine-readable format so that it can be reused at will by anyone. Once we have this alongside with the terminology, the idea is that we now identify types, then we can start identifying models to represent specific types. So for instance, you want to do unit conversion. Well, this is the transformation you need to do. So this is the way you can represent the transformation, for instance, right? So it's a multiplying factor, then the relation that links the two entities should be multiplying factor and the value, for instance. So this is the kind of things we want to do. And this we want to do for the different types of mappings, right? Based on what I presented in the Fair Impact presentation. And then once we have all that, the idea is to interlink, right? Because the use cases are going to be used for the terminology, but also for the model. Then basically they have a inherent relation between them. And the idea is that instead of having everything into a spreadsheet and in different places, we could try to put them together so that we get a searchable and browsable documentation on mapping. It might not be live all the time. It can be just shared. I don't know, we could share a RDF file and that you can upload in the graph database and search through Sparkle. That could be an output. We haven't thought about these kind of things. But the idea is that it aggregates the resources together, so it's helpful. Now, of course, one of the things that we will have to discuss is the sustainability model of that resource, right? Because at some point, well, when the group is finished, there will be no or few resources available. So we need to see how we maintain that and discuss with the different stakeholders. And if there are initiatives that are interested in taking it over and extending it, then that would be great. And of course, the FAIR recommendations. So there's a set of technical recommendations on how to make mapping fair. And we would like to come up with the grid for evaluating fairness of mappings. So in terms, we started discussing the work plan. So we started to identify the different types of activities we need to do in the working group. They are listed in the document. So if you have any comments, please add any comments on the document that is shared in the first slide. But basically, we need to revise the outputs of fair impact. And so that because it's going to have an impact on FAIRCORE for us as well. We need to create a harmonized use case template. So decide what is the meaningful information we need to collect. And once we have that, we need to go through to all the communities we know and engage with more communities to collect as many use cases we can, so that we can start the work of identifying the different types of mappings and documenting them to create the classification. And in the process, the idea would be to have a group or subgroup that works on the model as well, right? And so basically that hints to the structure of the working group. The working group should be organized as a whole, but in the working group, we intend to have subgroups which may deal with different aspects like the use case, the classification, the modeling, depending on your resources, the availability you have, the interest. But there's no restriction on being you don't have to be only one subgroup. The only thing is, if you join a subgroup, means that you want to be actively involved, and then we will be expecting work from you, and there will be deadlines. So right now, we cannot necessarily come up with a proper timeline that will be meaningful. I think we need to kickstart the work, and that should come from the internal discussions of the group, so that we can come up with key deadlines, internal deadlines. I don't think we need to have intermediate milestones because, well, we will release versions all the time. So everything is going to be transparent. In terms of meeting organization, well, the idea is that we have a global meeting every month to synchronize between the different subgroups and check the planning. And then there are weekly or bi-weekly, depending on the availabilities and the work that needs to be done, thematic subgroup meetings, so that things move forward in the subgroups. In terms of communication tools, we will use, of course, the RDA wiki for sharing documents, the RDA mailing list, so that everyone is aware of the progress. And we intend to use, we haven't decided yet, I know Barbara proposed kindly to use Mattermost. So that's something we need to look into, but we need something for asynchronous communication so that we can keep the, it's not just overburdening us on emails, which is really annoying when you search, when you use that for conversations, not really useful. And so the question is, what do you think about that? So where is my, I'm trying to get my Slido and don't know why it's supposed to start. So sorry, this is a technical issue. And I think I'll stop here. And I will directly start my Slido. What you do? Do you have any questions? So it's supposed to be interactive. We do have 20 minutes. So I mean, go ahead. Questions, comments, just shoot. Yes, Barbara.
Sorry that I step in, but
thanks for stepping in.
I had a question already in the chat. So, and you also answered it, but I still think it's important to address it. So you all mentioned concepts, terms, etc., and structures to map to each other, but I think also object properties might be useful to map to each other, because
sure.
This happens, and I need also to say, well, actually, I mean the same thing like there, but we use another object property because of lack of knowledge, whatever, but it happened, and I need to make this interoperable. So what are the suggestions for that? I didn't see any now, yeah, from you, therefore I'm asking.
Because we haven't started the work, Barbara.
That's
the technical work that needs to be done in the working group. So thanks for adding up to the list of to do.
So I just saw what we are trying to address, and this was not addressed.
Yeah, but they're in the list. So in the initial, because you're not the only one, in the initial slides when I presented the BoF survey, properties were actually part. So properties meaning object properties and other properties. So basically, yes, this is very important, and there's nothing that exists out there represent that. I don't have an answer to you. And the point is that that's the process that we want to set up. Is like you need to do object property mappings. You're certainly not the only one. What we need is please provide a use case in a standardized way with the concrete examples, like this is the kind of mapping I need to do, and this is the reason why, so that we do have the materials that we need to start thinking, okay, how can we model that?
Yeah. So
Right?
standardized.
So what kind of
way,
information
do
you
you
need
have
to
the
put in the
template
mappings?
for it? A standardized way? No, not yet. So we have to elaborate.
No. Yeah, so that's the practical work that needs to be done in the working group when we start the working group. So right now we're mostly focusing on getting the charter out because we need to go through the whole RDA process. Yes, Jonas.
Yeah, and if I can comment, so and the implementation in MSCR is addressing this problem. So this was actually one of the things that came up as a mapping issue. So it's not clear how this when you're mapping to or from an ontology, the kind of relationships, it's not clear from the current visualizations how these things should go together. So you basically just see classes and their properties, but the relationships are less than clear from that visualization. But yeah, we are working on that too.
And then it was not planned in OWL. So for instance, you can, in OWL, you would have equivalent class or you would have same as, but that just applies to class. That does not apply to object property. So it means that we need to find a way to further specify the relation.
Yeah, and of course we are storing the mappings are in a custom format, which is just everything that we need. So it's not going to be the exchange format.
But yeah, so we haven't started the whole work that I presented. It's just this is just in the planning. So of course, if there's anything that you think we need to add, just go. We'll add it to the charter. But we want to go through the administrative process in RDA, which means we need to finish the charter, send it for community review. Once we get the community review, we get the TAB review, and then there is another review step, so that we get a full-fledged validation of the working group as an existing working group. And then we can do like Gerard did yesterday, I think we can have the proper kickoff of the working group once it's created, right? So we still need to figure out this admin process, and once it's started, we can start discussing and maybe kind of identify a start date for the working group, right? No, if you are you're really motivated, we can start working outside of the context of the working group. But in that case, we need to organize specific meetings. And that will be certainly by around end of June, not before, or maybe end of the summer, because I know that everyone is busy right now. So it's a bit of a hell of a springtime with workshops and deadlines everywhere for everyone. So, so is there any other comments or questions? I mean, go ahead. It's for open discussion. So if not,
you can also comment about the.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just about to say that you can of course comment about the planned outputs of the working group by just raising your hand instead of the Slido if you want.
Yeah, I mean we use Slido, but for very basic questions. So maybe I can start then. So the first question we would like to ask you, what do you think about the current working group's output? Do you like them? Do you think there's room for improvement, or actually you don't like them and you think it's not going to be useful? So for those of you who say that there are improvements, can you write down in the chat what we can improve, please? Because I don't think it just check. I don't think it's in the next. Oh, I think there is a question about that. So where we can collect this input. We don't target any communities, Christian. We target all communities. All the communities, we would like to invite all the communities that are actually interested in doing mappings because they need it.
Yeah.
We want to come up with a generic solution, not a community-specific solution. Yes, Christian?
Yeah, I was just asking that because I just wanted to know, I know you target all the communities, but what are the current ones you are interacting with right now?
Directly or indirectly, we do have some connections with, well, the material science. Gerard has been contributing into the several bird of a feather. They have a working group on harmonized semantic artifact for material science. It's a longer name, but so we have material science. We do have some people from earth science, biomed, well, biodiversity with Barbara. I don't recall if we have social science represented.
So we don't have anybody from the climate community much.
I don't recall having anyone from climate community.
Jan,
yeah.
Jan, we have somebody from social science. I brought somebody in. So
great. Okay.
I don't know the name. Sorry, forgot it. But she's there. So she was there in the first.
Fantastic. So yeah, so we haven't targeted specific communities. So the idea is that those who are very interested contribute. And then there are different ways for community to contribute. They can contribute with use cases. And in that case, I think we're going to contact representatives of the communities directly that we know of so that we can collect their use case. And of course, make a generic call for review or at least feedback on the outputs. But yeah, but this is something that we need to work on as well. How do we engage with the communities? It's a good point. And there's no one from climate science as far as I know. So if you want to join, Christian, you're welcome.
Yes, thank you. I think it would be interesting because in the climate community, of course, we interact with other scientific domains and communities. And so mappings are important for that.
Yes, they are. All right, so we have 11 votes. Did everything express his opinion? The good thing is there's no one do not like the outputs. It means that what we're proposing is going to be meaningful anyway. So let me just go to the next. Claudia.
Yeah, I have two questions. Hi, Jan. The first one is for, I do understand correctly what you want to do is to give recommendations how to make the mappings fair, right? Very concrete ones, like use this. And then you want to have a knowledge base where everyone is putting the hopefully fair mappings and persistent identified mapping systems or schemas or whatever. Do you have already any plans which knowledge base to use? Because I'm asking again for the reliability, like will it be something like GitHub where you just fill in everything and then you download, or do you want to have any system that needs to be maintained by someone?
I don't know. So for now, we haven't decided on the system. I think the simplest one is to actually see if we can come up with a simple RDF structure, because then the knowledge base is just a file, right?
Yeah.
That everyone can just load in, so that there's no maintenance of a service and anything, and you just access to things through Sparkle. Maybe some other format, because not everyone is able to actually make requests on Sparkle. Now, we don't necessarily want to open the knowledge base for direct contribution, because then there's no curation process. It's going to be tricky. The idea is that the flow comes from the working group, where we do get use case and we collect use case on the go, and even after the end of working group, the idea is that if new use cases show up, then we add that to the list, and then we do the connections, because it means that we need to go through the process, get the use case, analyze the use case, see if we need to extend the terminology with a new class of mappings, and then if it's a case, then we need to create maybe another kind of model, or when I say model, it's like it might be just a relation between the two entities, because it requires a more complex transformation that the generic model offers. And then we streamline at the end the addition as an element of the knowledge base. You see what I mean? And then for service, we haven't thought about this. And then I think we'll see this along the way, how we want to do that. And because we also need to think in terms of sustainability, we need to do something that's easy to maintain. Because we don't have resources within RDA. The only person that have resources are Jonas and me, because we're funded. So at some point it's going to end May 25, which means that there will be 9 months to go without funding. So of course there are grants we can apply, small money that RDA is offering to do things, but it's just short term. So we'll have to think in terms of longer term plan. But if you have any idea, we are all totally open in suggestions.
For funding? Sure, I have the millions behind. Just get a European Commission guy. No.
Thanks. I'll give you my account number.
Yeah, exactly. No, I have yet another question, if there are no others urgent ones. In how far this, I mean, okay, you start with a recommendation, like how do you make mappings or crosswalks fair? That's fine. But can you tell me how that could relate to terminology services? Because in a way, terminology services are doing exactly that, right? Or trying to do this, implementing different models, no?
Not all the terminology services, to my knowledge. The only one I know that includes mappings internally, because they compute the mapping directly, it's on the portal. So, but the thing is just for terminology, so the link should be done through APIs between the connections between the services. Because, for instance, if you do terminology mappings, you need to extract information about the terminology itself, the concept, the label, the metadata associated with it. You don't necessarily want to have everything within the mapping file, because that's something that you can retrieve from the terminology service. So there will be connections. Now we don't have. So it could be interesting to think about an architecture diagram to see how these services are going to be interconnected. But the thing is, we have limited resources. And I don't know if we can just go that far. Right?
Yeah.
But there will be connections.
I'm thinking, because I'm working now for a project that wants to have a blueprint for the integration of terminology services and Earth system science, and maybe there could be a way to connect it to the guidelines you are going, or the recommendations you are going to develop. But I will just write you an email and stop my talk.
Sure. And no, but that's interesting. I mean, we could see if there is a use case we can integrate.
I thought about that.
There will be mapping needed. So yeah. So we move to the next question, which was, are the working group output clear enough? So the thing is just, we try to scope these outputs just to make sure it's not too vague, and we want to make sure it's clear. So see that we have 7 people voting, which is okay. So if you want to, maybe we can move to the next one. Do you think our objectives are realistic? That's the question we've been wondering. That relates to what Claudia was mentioning. And that's the working group. We are not all funded, and even if we're funded to do the work, there's limitations. Of course, the idea would be to associate the activities of the working group with any project you're involved. So if it's an activity that you have ongoing on another project, that's a way to link it. But we know that it's hard. And what we would like is to have committed people to actually do things. And that's why we want to have objectives that are achievable. Adam, I see you raise your hand. Adam, go ahead.
Hey, and so yeah, just there's not an option for maybe, or it depends. And I think that with my experience as a co-chair on another project, part of it is, I think, how much traction you get within the community, right? And even with the kind of monthly / weekly co-division, I think overall they are realistic, depending on the kind of engagement and contributions that you get. And I think, it's one of those things where I'm really interested in this, but I don't know how much I can commit to, because I think that one of the things that we really need to do is stop building Excel spreadsheets and then just siloing them somewhere else, or and things like onto portal and stuff solve, as just you said, some of the problem, but not really in that kind of way of making things accessible. And then there's a whole thing about connecting everything up and making it all machine actionable rather than just having registries and so on. So I think this is really important, and I wonder if you have like a sense of like a minimum viable set of outputs that would be kind of like, this is the goal, this is the thing that we're in, and but maybe kind of this is what will make a good impact and a difference, no matter how many engaged or coming and going people we have.
Yeah, so that's a very good point. I understand that it's hard to answer directly. I mean, the idea is just overall, right? So just get a sense of, well, guys, you're crazy. You're never going to achieve that because that's a lot of work. In terms of commitment, again, I mean, we are creating this working group because we do get support from the European Commission in the context of our project. So this is work we would do anyway in the project. So that's the plus, which means that both Jonas and myself are committed to the working group and to make sure that things advance. Now, we can also limit ourselves in the sense that the minimum viable product would be that we come up with a minimum set of use cases that cover a broad range of types, right? That's why I'm also cautious about classification versus ontology, because if you start ontology work, that's a lot of effort, not necessarily have it. But the idea is that, for instance, we could start with, there was 13 use cases that were presented at the last BoF. So we could start with that. There are use cases that are used in Faircore for EOSC. I know that Nico Matensoglu from SESOM has tons of them as well. So we could try to pull like 20-25 use cases and start working on that to kickstart the work and lay out the foundations of the classification, maybe extend it to an initial terminology / ontology, and then start working on the modeling aspects, or like for special cases like data mappings. How would you represent in tabular format, but also in RDF, the transformation rule that goes from one data element to the other, or even the metadata to the other. And there already, if you start having this kind of solutions that are embedded within the global model of SESOM, I think that's what would be achieved. So in terms of contribution, that's what we need to figure out in terms of engagement with the communities. We understand that you have limited time and resources. There are different ways of contributing. You can just provide use cases. That's, that would be already quite helpful, right? Because if you want to do a classification, you need to know what are the different cases. And so that is helpful. That a couple of hours max, and you already have made a significant contribution. And then if you have more time, then we'll be happy to have you discussing on the modeling, or you can validate. So that's the kind of different levels of contribution we might also need to identify internally in the group, so that we can get out with different the proper output. Barbara.
Yes, I just wanted to say something about success in a RDA working group. As you know, I'm co-chairing a lot, and we are quite successful. But I must say, it's very much depending on the coordination. So if you coordinate it well and you also put in a lot of effort yourself as a coordinator, you will be able to engage other people. So that's my experience. So if everybody's waiting for your input to structure, and then you can have very valuable contributions. And you need a core group, at least 6 people that always come and not always change. You know, if you have each time somebody else, in addition, fine, but you need a core group. Otherwise, it will fail. So it is not, I cannot answer this. Depends on your engagement, on your BoF, or how many you have now as co-chairs. That's just my feedback.
Thank you, Barbara. So I move to the next question, which is, what do you think we should add? I forgot to say change as well, like updates. Is there any things we need to improve? I mean, there were some votes on you need to improve. So what can we improve and how? And that would be useful. Now I see the questions from Claudia. So no, there are 5 outputs that are planned, right? The recommendation on how to make mapping fairs is only 1. The other are, what kind of model do you use to share the mappings? Which is linked to the recommendations, because of course we're gonna say for interoperability, use that model and that format, or these formats we can agree on. Anything you think that we should add or change? It's time to actually, so I see minimum viable products. Is there anything else that you think we should update?
Yeah, and just we're gone kind of a few minutes past the half hour, which is unfortunate. But yeah, I don't know, we just think about maybe wrapping up soon.
Short phased roadmap is, of course, something important. Yes. So that what remains to be done in the charter. So that's why we started establishing the list of activities, so that we can identify how we orchestrate them in time. Well, roughly, like. Okay, so I think we can stop here. The Slido is still open, so if you want to put some feedback, just go ahead, please. I would like to thank you all for joining and contributing to this effort. Interesting, comprehensive list of reference. Okay, and I think we can stop here. So I would like to thank you again. Thank, of course, my co-chair and Ryan for helping me for co-organizing this session. There will be another session next week, a repeat session. It's unfortunate because that would be at the same time. We were hoping to have it later for our US colleagues, but I guess the difficulty of managing the agenda of the RDA plenary makes it this way. So there will be other opportunity to discuss this next week.
So I've just put a
Ryan?
I've just put a link to the next steps for the groups. Obviously, the case statement being finalized, we'll be working on that. And then we'll hopefully initiate the community review period for the case statement. We do also, I know we didn't get a chance to speak about this, we do still need co-chairs as well. So we're obviously going to have to be doing a little bit of work in that in the background. But of those of you remaining, if you do think you might be interested in possibly becoming co-chair of the group, there's a short form there. We've just please feel free to just it's just get in touch with us via that forum. We're happy to kind of to speak to you. Even if you're just interested, you know, it's not a yes no thing. If you think you might be interested and might have time to do it, then we can talk you through what the plans for the group has and what support is available from a Tiger project as well. So I know Barbara mentioned that being organized is and the effort that the co-chairs make is one of the key determinants of whether the group will be a success. But that's kind of where that's my job basically, to make that life of the co-chairs a little bit easier. So I'm happy to discuss that with anyone who might be interested in future.
Cheers. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.